Recording. You now see on your screen something like this is a recording and you have to confirm that. Did that arrive on your side?
Yes,
Yeah.
okay.
It's confirmed?
Yes, confirmed.
Perfect. So let's go, okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Just there we go. Okay, let's go. Working together. You probably work in a team and you often think, well, how is it possible to work together in a way that works best for everyone? And the question is, what are the best practices here? And we have someone with us today who is an expert on exactly that matter. The author of The Hive Mind at Work, Harnessing the Power of Group Intelligence to Create Meaningful and Lasting Change. Hello and welcome, Siobhan McHale.
Hello, great to be with you here today, Niels.
Thank you very much for being here with us today. And I get straight into the topic, the hive mind at work. What are some of the lessons we can actually learn? Because when people hear about, okay, how do bees operate? And people say, I'm not a bee, am I? Or is there anything we can learn from them?
Yes, well, obviously we're not bees, but we can learn some lessons from the bees. And what I talk about is the need to move not just from IQ and EQ. IQ and EQ are necessary, but not sufficient in today's world of volatile change. We actually need what I call group intelligence, which the
Mhm.
bees, of course, have.
Excellent. So when we now have IQ and EQ. Most HR departments will say, look, we're looking for the best talent. So we do IQ because we look about talent, we look at qualifications, we look at degrees, probably IQ, EQ. Why is group intelligence so the GQ in this case more effective in bringing about workplace change than the traditional IQ and EQ options?
Well, IQ is good for technical problems where you need logic and reasoning. EQ is good for emotional problems when you've got interpersonal issues with another person. But GQ is good for understanding group dynamics and being able to intervene successfully in groups to help them perform, to adapt, or to grow.
Mm. Do you think this is a fit for any organization? Because probably you can now think of people who say, look, I work in the public sector. The public sector is quite slow in change, as you know. So maybe this whole GQ thing is more for the private sector than for the public sector. What's your take on that?
Well, wherever you are as a manager or as a leader, you need to be able to understand how that group works, whether it be a whole organization or government department, whether it be a business unit, or whether it be your team. The more you can understand group dynamics, the more you can intervene successfully to help that group to perform and to adapt successfully.
Mm. What can leaders do then when they say, okay, our workplace change is usually slow or maybe even too slow? And maybe some of the leaders might say, look, this is just how things are here. This is just how things were. This is how things will be. What would you give as advice here?
Yes, well, you've got to be able to understand what exactly is going on in the organization. What is the dynamic and the assumptions underpinning that? And then have the skills to intervene in that system in order to bust those assumptions and create a different way of operating. I don't think it's good enough anymore for people to say, well, that's just the way we work around here. What do you do as a leader when you're faced with that challenge is the key question.
So, what would you say if someone now listens to this podcast and say, I'm a leader in an organization. I would like to have change being a bit more agile, a bit quicker, a bit faster in my organization. However, I'm surrounded by maybe other leaders who are quite senior, quite saturated. They are there for a long time and they might disagree and say, let's just take things slower. It's still working. So, how to work when you're maybe one of the leaders who is of the opinion to be quicker with change while others around you are not?
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the things I talk about in the hive mind at work is being able to diagnose the system or the ecosystem in which you operate. and really figure out how that system is operating and what are the roles that are contributing to a slowdown in change or to an acceleration in change. And then how can you step into a role yourself to influence and reframe those roles? And I've got many examples of where we actually did that, reframing roles at the individual level, but even more importantly, at the collective level.
Excellent. Could you give us an example here?
Yeah, so I worked at the NZ Bank, where it actually, after 7 years, it went from the worst performing bank in the country to the #1 bank globally on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index after a 7-year journey. And when I walked into the bank, the executives had no idea what to do, because it was, everybody was depressed. Nobody wanted to work there. The customers, bank bashing had become a national sport. And everything they tried seemed to only take the organization backwards. And what we did was step back and notice what was going on in the bank. And it had what I call the order taker pattern. So the order givers in head office gave the orders to the 700 branches who were in role of order taker, and really victims. They just sat there, took the orders, and the energy was just leaking out of the whole organization. So by seeing that pattern, we were able to rewire it, and we stopped doing things that were making no difference. We started getting to the underlying issue, the underlying pattern.
So would you say that really any organization is able to adapt your system of how to change into the GQ way of doing things?
Yes, I would say in these times of a flux of change, unprecedented change, you cannot fall back on the old IQ and EQ anymore. The technical solutions or the technical fixes don't work. The emotional intelligence and the interpersonal does not work. You need to be able to work with complex adaptive ecosystems in order to survive and thrive into the future.
Excellent. Am I right? Because I just looked this up. Professor John Cotter used your work with ANZ Bank as a Harvard Business School case study. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Wow, congratulations. How did that happen? I mean, there are probably millions of consultants out there who say, I would love to have any of my work anywhere near Harvard. I'm not even talking about being a business case there. And I mean, John Cotter is one of the biggest names in that area when it gets to change. How did that happen?
Well, I spent a decade as an external consultant, and then I moved to become an insider. So really, I've been the executive in charge of change for a number of decades in a series of international firms. I was actually in the role in ANZ of being that executive in charge of change. So I wasn't a consultant. That's the first point. And the second point is Cotter asked around. He asked his network, who is doing amazing things when it comes to change? And his network told him, ANZ, they're doing something different. So I was literally sitting at my desk one day, and the call got patched through from reception. And it was John Cotter. I'd read all of his books. I nearly fell off my chair. And he just said, I've heard about your work, and I'd like to do a case study on what you've been doing at the ANZ Bank.
That must have been a pretty good day in the office, right?
It was. It was a very, very good day, because he has been my idol for many decades, and he is a huge supporter now of my work.
Brilliant, brilliant, excellent. So when you now talk about this kind of change, there might be people listening now and say, look, I just think our leaders do not have the skills, or let's say they don't know which skills we need. So what do you think are the skills necessary for navigating that kind of change in today's more, let's say, complex work environment?
Yes, you really got to put on a different pair of glasses, because we have been taught to do technical fixes. So when you ask a marketing manager, they can develop a plan for a product launch. A finance manager can develop a budget. An engineer can develop a plan for designing an arc bridge across a wide river. But if you ask those people to design a change for a group or an organization where people have to shift their roles and reframe how they're doing things, many of those leaders draw a blank. because
Hmm.
they haven't been taught to do this work. So it needs people to develop a new lens, a new set of skills. It's not enough even to have EQ, emotional intelligence, where you're delving into your own emotions and understanding others' emotions. Of course, that's important, but EQ won't help you to navigate complex change that I talked about in the bank, for example.
Mm.
And often these changes, Niels, are like a spider web. On your left, you might see a thread that's about poor customer satisfaction. On your
Hmm.
right, you might see disengaged employees. You look up and you see a thread that's about poor quality. You look down and you see, oh, we don't seem to be able to grow, and we've got safety issues. Now, which of those threads do you pull? And the more you pull those threads, the more enmeshed you often seem to get. So you've got to be able to do what the great systems thinker Gregory Bateson talked about. What are the patterns that connect? In that mess, it's not really a mess. If you can, like we did figure out at the ANZ, we figured out that they were caught by the order taker pattern. That
Mm.
made sense of all of the complexity. And that
Hmm.
is the paradox in complex systems, that they are often underpinned by very simple rules or patterns that govern the ecosystem.
Brilliant. So when we see what you did with ANZ now, uh, let's just be straightforward here. We all know many organizations where some leader turned up, says, okay, now we're going to change things. And 1 year later, you say, okay, nothing changed. And this is
Mm,
happening once a year. This is happening very frequently in lots of organizations where either
mm,
well-paid consultants or well-paid managers or executives have this high goal of now we're going to change everything. 1 or 2 years later, you get to the conclusion, you turn things around, but we actually ended
mm.
up where we were before. So why do so many workplace changes efforts fail to deliver?
Yes, very good question. Well, essentially, often leaders are doing what they know how to do. They are implementing technical fixes without really bringing about any change. So, for example, when I walked into the ANZ, they had just undergone a major restructure, but the
Hmm.
restructure actually took the organization backwards. It
Oh.
disengaged people, and it caused a lot of stress, a lot of internal navel gazing rather than looking outside. So their technical intervention actually brought the ecosystem backwards and created more and more problems. And leaders often do this. They are taught to have a machine mindset. So organizations, they see them like machines, and they think, right, if I pull this lever, if I drive this, if I oil this gadget, if I tweak this, fix that, fix that, fix
Hmm.
that, and
Hmm.
this fix the machine mindset doesn't work in complex adaptive ecosystems. So it takes the system backwards. So this is why I say we've got to develop the group intelligence, the GQ, to know, firstly, what are the issues, not the symptoms? What are the underlying patterns that are governing this system? And two, how do I intervene in a way that doesn't bring up unintended consequences in the system?
Excellent. So when people now look at your book, The Hive Mind at Work, Harnessing the Power of Group Intelligence to Create Meaningful and Lasting Change, some people might now think it's quite complex, isn't it? How can this all be put into a book? What can people expect when they start reading your book?
Okay, the two big things that I give them, and I'm very practical, Niels, because I'm a
Very excellent.
practitioner. I'm an
Mhm.
insider. I'm not a
Brilliant.
theorist. I'm not talking from the ivory tower. So I give them two key things. The first thing I give people is the 9 laws of group dynamics. You
Mhm.
must understand the 9 laws of group dynamics if you are going to successfully intervene in a group. The second thing I give them with lots of case studies is the 4 key steps that you need to undertake in order to apply GQ to a change challenge. So those two really practical ways of understanding groups. If you don't understand groups, then you can't manage them. So yeah, so one of those laws of groups, for example, is the law of role. And I talk about how role influences our behavior in a way that is just as powerful as personality.
Excellent. So when I got that right, because some people often complain about books and say, look, I'm not really a science person. It's all very theoretical, but your book is very hands-on so people can read it and straightforward implement it in their businesses.
Correct. That's what I'm about. I'm an insider. I want to have practical solutions for people because I have been in organizations as the executive in charge of change for 2 decades. So I've sifted through a lot of the dross to come up with solutions that have cut through and that really work rather than theory from the ivory tower.
Excellent. So wrapping this all up, when someone is now listening to this and say, look, I might read your book and then I probably talk to one of my executives or to one of my leaders or colleagues. I'm an executive myself and I'm not the only one in the organization, of course. And then now look for, let's say, the top 1, 2, 3 tips. So what are Siobhan McHale's top 3 tips when people say, amazing system. However, where do I start? I may be the only one who has now the mindset of we need to change properly. And here is how I could do this. But where to start when I am in the beginning the only one? What is your take on that to wrap this all up?
Okay, my take on that is map the system. You need to be able to draw, almost just take a pen and paper and draw the ecosystem and the roles that people are taking up in that ecosystem that work for or against the change. So you could have roles of supporter, a role of critic, a role of a passenger, or a role of order taker. You could have a multitude of roles that are either working for or against the change. And notice what patterns are governing the system. And there are a multitude of patterns, but what specifically is going on, the agreements, the hidden agreements between the parts, that's what you've got to uncover. And the second one is reframe the roles at the individual and collective level. And then the third one is how you nudge the system forward. Nudging is important because it doesn't bring up resistance. If you try and push too hard for change, guess what happens? The system pushes back. So you've got to find ways of nudging the system in order to accelerate change.
Brilliant. These are amazing tips. And I can tell you from what I've read, I read the whole book and I can tell you, I highly recommend you to buy your copy right now. At the end of this interview, The Hive Mind at Work, Harnessing the Power of Group Intelligence to Create Meaningful and Lasting Change by Siobhan McHale. I can tell you there's a reason why this, meanwhile, with the ANZ is now a business case from John Cotter at Harvard Business School. So at the end of this interview, there's only one thing left for me to say. Siobhan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Niels, for your time as well.